I'm Laura. I am an occupational therapist and I'm a certified lymphedema therapist. And for this video I wanted to start talking about what the lymphatic system is, because to understand how lymphedema is caused and to understand why we treat lymphedema in a specific way, you really have to have a basic understanding of how the lymphatic system functions, and it kind of makes everything else make more sense. So the lymphatic system is part of our circulatory system in that it moves fluid around our body. But it's very different from the way that our blood flow works. And I'll give you a few reasons of why it's so different. But I'll start out by saying that the lymphatic system moves lymphatic fluid. And lymphatic fluid contains fluid, but it also contains some of the larger molecules and things around our body that need to be moved that are too large for our venous system to move into the bloodstream and transport that way. So the lymphatic fluid is going to contain things like proteins. Proteins are really large, so it's difficult for the venous system to actually move them for us. Parts of cells that have been broken up, things like white blood cells, and that brings in that whole component of the lymphatic system having a really strong tie to our immune function. Different particles that need to be moved, fat cells, and bacteria. Again, bacteria that needs to be processed by white blood cells and moved out of the body. So that lymphatic fluid is moved through lymphatic vessels, which are completely separate from our veins and our arteries, but they're usually located very close to each other in the body. So usually there'll be a system where there's a vein and it's dropping off nutrients and oxygen and all those things that our body and our cells need to survive. And then any extra fluid that needs to get processed out, about 90% of that fluid gets reabsorbed into the vein and then moved through the body to get processed. About 10%, maybe a little bit more sometimes, is processed by the lymphatic system. And then any of those components that are too large to be reabsorbed by the veins get processed by the lymphatic system. So there's a nice relationship there, and they're usually located close to each other so that they can have that process of working together. Now, I think it helps if you compare our veins and our arteries and the way that that moves blood through our body with the way that our lymphatic system moves fluid and substances through our body. So the one important difference is that your blood flow works from a central pump, and that central pump is your heart. So that constant heartbeat of contracting and relaxing moves the blood through your whole body. It creates blood pressure, which gives it the strength to be able to move against gravity and get to all the different places that it needs to get at the ends of our body, especially fingers and toes. It has to work really hard to get the circulation all the way around there. The venous and arterial system are connected, and they form this loop. So it goes from your heart pumps, it pushes the blood out, goes to where it needs to go, comes back, we get oxygenation from the lungs, and it all works in this continuous loop as everything gets moved around the body. Now the lymphatic system, on the other hand, is not a circular loop. It just goes from the ends of our body. So it starts with these very small capillaries in our skin, and it moves toward the center in progressively larger and larger vessels, until eventually it comes into the center of the body and up into these corners of the neck right behind our collarbones, and at that point it dumps into our blood supply. So at that point it joins with your blood, and that's the end of your lymphatic system. So it's kind of different in the fact that it goes from the periphery into the center of the body, whereas your blood flow is a circular system and it's a closed system. So your blood flow moves a lot more fluid than your lymphatic system. And in terms of blood flow, we're talking about liters per minute. Your heart is really strong, pumps really hard, moves a lot of fluid very quickly. Your lymphatic system works very slowly, and it might only move between 1 and 2 liters of fluid a day. Now, where that becomes important is if there's a breakdown in your lymphatic system, then not moving 1 to 2 liters of fluid in a day can become a really big problem. So part of how the blood flow works is that it's that circular system, but the lymphatic flow, because it goes from the periphery and toward the center, needs to have a constant pressure behind it. And since it doesn't have a central pump like the heart to create that movement, It relies on your muscles to contract and relax, to create an external pump, to put pressure on the vessels and make sure that there's a constant fluid movement up the limb or into the lymph node bed so that it gets where it needs to go. We find that when we don't move as much, then the lymphatic system has even more difficulty moving that fluid because the contracting and relaxing of the muscles isn't helping to create that pressure that it needs. Breathing is a really big part of that too. The movement of the diaphragm causes this pressure change in your thoracic cavity. Every time you inhale and exhale, the pressure changes. And that pressure change allows fluid to move more quickly. Also helps with your digestion and a bunch of other things like that. So breathing deeply is hugely important to this, and really most health conditions in general are helped by deep breathing. But it's really important in making sure that the lymphatic system has that change of pressure back and forth to help with that pumping action. So the venous and arterial system moves about 90%, maybe 80% of the fluid in your body. Then the lymphatic system is going to pick up that extra 10 to 20%, somewhere around there, so that there's really good fluid movement through the body, and those two together make a strong circulatory system. So when that's all working well, things are great. You have these lymphatic capillaries, which are the smallest lymphatic vessels, and they are all throughout your body, and they form this mesh, this network, where the fluid is picked up as the veins drop it off, and any extra things that need to be moved get put into the lymphatic capillaries. Now, what becomes really important in understanding the anatomy of the lymphatic system is how these capillaries and the precollectors, which are the next largest vessel in your lymphatic system, what their structure is, because these are the parts of the lymphatic system that actually pick up the fluid and pick up the proteins and move them. What makes your lymphatic system very different from your venous system is that they have these little swinging doors. So you can think of the lymphatic vessel, the capillary specifically, and they have these little swinging doors that will open and close. And these swinging doors have anchoring filaments on them that connect them to the tissue around them. So if you think about that as being your skin, it's connected to your skin. So when there's too much fluid in there, it puts pressure, and those anchoring filaments are pulled so that the door opens. Fluid moves into the vessel. It closes because the pressure is then released, and then that fluid is moved along where it needs to go. So that becomes really important in the way that we treat lymphedema and problems with the lymphatic system, because we can use those anchoring filaments and that open and closing of those flaps in the lymphatic capillaries to move the fluid the way that we want it to move. So the important thing with that too is that these little pieces of the capillaries are called a lymphangion, and that just means one unit of that lymph vessel. And they have a little bit of ability to contract and relax to create movement of fluid. It's not very strong, and if they get overwhelmed, it becomes very inefficient. They kind of spasm a little bit. They're not coordinated in which one is contracting and which one is relaxing so that the fluid moves in the proper direction. So it's very important not to overwhelm these vessels. And even though they're slightly larger than our venous and arterial capillaries, they are very sensitive and very easily overwhelmed, so we have to be very delicate with them, and that comes in later when we do our treatment for lymphedema. It's a very gentle, delicate treatment when we do the manual aspect of that. So coming back up to just the structure of the lymphatic system and how we progress from smaller vessels to larger vessels as you get toward the center of the body, we start out with those capillaries and the precollectors. That's where the lymphatic fluid is taken out of the cellular space, we call it interstitial space, in between the structures of the body. And it gets drawn into the capillaries or the precollectors. Once it's in the vessel, then we call it lymphatic fluid. So these parts of our lymphatic system are actually divided into territories. And territories are just segments of our body that drain into a particular lymph node bed. So like the arm, the lymph node fluid, or the lymph fluid from the arm would drain into the lymph nodes in our armpit, our axillary lymph nodes. The fluid from our leg is going to drain into our inguinal lymph nodes, or the ones at the groin. And there's a lot of different lymph node beds throughout the body. We have a lot at the neck, armpits, there's a few in the elbows, a few behind the knees, things like that. There's a lot clustered through the center of the body, which is why when we do our drainage techniques, we spend some time working on the center of the body. But these territories are divided into something called a watershed. And a watershed just decides which way the fluid is going to move. If the fluid is going to this lymph node bed or the fluid is going to that lymph node bed. So there's these imaginary lines that divide the body from top to bottom, side to side. There's one that goes right around the spine of the scapula. There's one that divides the gluteal area. And you can look at a picture, and I'll try to put a picture of this in there so you can see the dividing lines in the body. And I think of these watersheds being like the peak of a mountain. So if it's raining and the rain comes down, it's either going to roll down this side of the mountain and go into this lake, or it's going to roll down that side of the mountain and go into that lake. The watersheds in the body work the same way. So this watershed that goes down the center of my body here, the fluid on this side of my body is going to drain into these lymph nodes, and then the fluid on this side of my body is going to drain into these lymph nodes. Now where the problems arise is, say that I had radiation on this side, and my lymph nodes in my armpit aren't really functioning very well, or my lymph vessels aren't moving fluid as well as they need to. There's a connection between the two sides that isn't normally used, but can be utilized if you're having problems on this side. So the manual techniques that we do actually move the water from this territory across the watershed line into that territory so that we can use the healthy lymph nodes on this side to drain the fluid, because they're still working well and they'll be able to take the extra volume. So that's where it's important to understand. And what we'll see is the body is very strict with these watersheds, to the point where if you've had radiation here and these lymph nodes aren't working very well, the watershed line goes down the center and across from the belly button. So you might have a pocket of fluid right on the side of your body that stops at that line. And it'll be very clear where the end of that fluid pocket is because of that watershed line. So then of course we can move it down across that watershed to use the surrounding lymph nodes that are still healthy, but it has to be done manually. The body won't do it automatically. And that's where the manual lymphatic drainage comes in, to move the fluid where we want it to go. But that's why it's important to understand the territories and the watersheds and how that is connected to what lymph node beds are being used for what area of the body. So then after we clear through those, the fluid moves into larger vessels, which are called collectors. The collectors are going to move through your lymph nodes, and your lymph nodes are like little scrubbers. So since our lymphatic fluid is going to be dumped back into our blood, we want to make sure that it's cleaned a little bit before it goes back in there. And it'll get filtered out more through the kidneys and things like that, but before it gets dumped into our blood supply, we have these little lymph nodes that scrub out things, check how much bacteria there is, see if there's any things that are out of the ordinary that would warrant an immune response. And just kind of clean it up in general so that the fluid that leaves the lymph nodes and goes to the larger vessels is a little bit cleaner than when it came in. So then we get trunks, and then we get ducts, and Okay, so the fluid leaving the lymph nodes is a lot cleaner than the fluid that came into the lymph node. So once it leaves the lymph node, then we have these progressively larger vessels. We have lymphatic trunks and lymphatic ducts, which is just moving more centrally through the body, through the middle of the trunk. And then the duct, the final duct, is the one that comes right up into the back of the collarbones. And this area is called the venous angle. The left and the right venous angle are where we're actually dumping the lymphatic fluid into. This fancy connection is called the lymphovenous anastomosis, meaning your lymphatic system and your venous system are joining together, and anastomosis is just a joining. And this space here is called the supra, which means above, clavicular fossa. So it just means above your collarbone in this little indent. And that's an important spot because that's always where we start and end our lymphatic drainage, because that's the very end of your lymphatic system. So I think that pretty much covers everything for the structure of your lymphatic system and what it does in our body. Now, because the lymphatic system is so strongly related to our immune function, these are things that we can use to our advantage when you feel like you're getting sick or your allergies are acting up. A lot of the things that we'll learn later for manual lymphatic drainage are really helpful for that. I'll use them if I feel like I'm getting a cold or I'm just kind of run down. Make sure that the lymphatic system is moving and it has the ability to do its job so that you won't get sick as easily. So it's really helpful information in terms of that. Okay, so next few videos we're going to start to get into the treatment aspects of lymphedema. Thank you so much.